Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story begins at the White House in Washington, D.C. on a February day in 1865. There, President Abraham Lincoln, who was weary from the burdens of a commander-in-chief approaching his fourth year of civil war, in which he's presided over an unprecedented amount of carnage unequal to any time in our history. Still, part of his responsibilities, part of the customs of the presidency, the office of president, is to meet with the public, and he does so every weekday. On this day, this February day in 1865, he's doing his usual work at 2 o'clock. The main doors of the White House are swung open, and in comes the crowds with various questions and requests. During one conversation with a visitor, he learns from the individual that this person was related to John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the former Vice President of the United States during the previous administration of James Buchanan. Of course, Breckinridge, as you students of the Civil War know, became a Confederate general and a member of the cabinet of Jefferson Davis. Breckinridge was, in fact, the highest ranking U.S. politician next to former President John Tyler to join the Confederacy and be involved in the politics of the new country. At least that's according to my research. Back to that White House conversation, Lincoln reportedly responded to the visitor, "I was fond of John and regret that he sided with the South. It was a mistake." Well, it's easy to understand Lincoln's point of view from where we sit today. Breckinridge, pictured here, earned and enjoyed great respect during his time in Washington. As one of the youngest vice presidents at age 36, he went on to be the 1860 Democratic nominee for vice president, with Stephen Douglas as the presidential top of the ticket. Following that loss to Abraham Lincoln, Breckinridge was seated as a U.S. senator and urged compromise strongly to prevent war. All this was happening in March of 1861. However, as the southern states seceded and South Carolina troops bombarded the Union garrison of Fort Sumter, Breckinridge's pro-Union stance began to shift, and by October of 1861, he openly announced the Union no longer existed in his home state of Kentucky and that the state should do as it pleased. Breckinridge turned his back on the U.S. Senate, and his fellow senators responded by branding him a traitor. Breckinridge went on to become a Confederate general, as I mentioned earlier, and suffer his fate with the rest of the Confederacy. In an attempt to learn more about Breckinridge's disloyalty, I was doing a little bit of research and found a speech that he gave on January 4th, 1859. Then Vice President Breckinridge stood before senators gathered in their chamber to celebrate a move to a new space in the Capitol building. The current space that they were in had become crowded. It was designed for a much smaller country and a far fewer representatives. It had grown beyond its capacity. The Capitol building was expanding too. They were extending wings, and of course, adding a new dome. That dome was underway of being dismantled so that the new one could be put in its place. The vice president's remarks on that January 4th, 1859, momentous occasion of the move from the old chamber to the new chamber are notable for his love of the Constitution. And just 2 years before Civil War and his move to the Confederacy, I want to share some excerpts from this powerful speech. So, in the words of Vice President Breckinridge, he spoke, "The career of the United States cannot be measured by that of any other people of whom history gives account, and the mind is almost appalled by the contemplation of the prodigious force which has marked their progress. 69 years ago, 13 states containing 3 millions of inhabitants, burdened with debt and exhausted by the long war of independence, established for their common good a free constitution on principle new to mankind, and began their experiment with the good wishes of a few doubting friends and the derision of the world. Look at the result today. 28 millions of people, in every way happier than an equal number in any other part of the globe. The center of population and political power descending the western slopes of the Allegheny Mountains and the original 13 states, forming but the eastern margin on the map of our vast possessions. See besides Christianity, civilization, and the arts given to a continent, the despised colonies grown into a power of the first class, representing and protecting ideas that involve the progress of the human race, a commerce greater than that of any other nation, free interchange between the states, every variety of climate, soil, and production to make a people powerful and happy. In a word, behold present greatness, and in the future, an empire to which the ancient mistress of the world in the height of her glory could not be compared. Such is our country, aye, and more, far more than my mind could conceive or my tongue could utter. Is there an American who regrets the past? Is there one who will deride his country's laws, pervert her constitution, or alienate her people? If there be such a man, let his memory descend to posterity, laden with the execrations of all mankind. So happy is the political and social condition of the United States, and so accustomed are we to the secure enjoyment of a freedom elsewhere unknown, that we are apt to undervalue the treasures we possess and to lose, in some degree, the sense of obligation to our forefathers. But when the stripes of faction shake the government or even threaten it, we may pause with advantage long enough to remember that we are reaping the reward of other men's labors. This liberty we inherit, this admirable constitution which has survived peace and war, prosperity and adversity, this double scheme of government, state and federal, so peculiar and so little understood by other powers, yet which protects the earnings of industry and makes the largest personal freedom compatible with public order, these great results were not achieved without wisdom and toil and blood. The touching and heroic record is before the world, but to all this we were born, and, like heirs upon whom has been cast a great inheritance, have only the high duty to preserve, to extend, and to adorn it. The grand productions of the era in which the foundations of this government were laid reveal the deep sense its founders had of their obligations to the whole family of man. Let us never forget that the responsibilities imposed on this generation are by so much the greater than those which rested on our revolutionary ancestors, as the population, extent, and power of our country surpass the dawning promise of its origin. And now, senators, we leave this memorable chamber bearing with us, unimpaired, the Constitution we received from our forefathers. Let us cherish it with grateful acknowledgments to the divine power who controls the destinies of empires and whose goodness we admire. The structures reared by men yield to the corroding tooth of time. These marble walls must molder into ruin, but the principles of constitutional liberty, guarded by wisdom and virtue, unlike material elements, do not decay. Let us devoutly trust that another Senate and another age shall bear to a new and larger chamber this Constitution, vigorous and inviolate, and that The last generation of posterity shall witness the deliberations of the representatives of American states still united, prosperous, and free. Such a speech by Vice President Breckinridge, January 4th, 1859, getting close to the height of tensions and polarized politics that had divided the country. You'll notice in the excerpt I read, which is just a fraction of the much longer speech that he gave, there's no mention of slavery. In fact, in the entire speech, no mention of slavery. And yet he talks about freedom. He talks about all humankind and freedom, talks about the building of the country, the prosperity and peace and happiness of its citizens, but he does not mention the slaves, the enslaved people. I do wonder what the reaction of the speech was in those two factions. I suspect that in those states that were pro-slavery, and for Northerners who were pro-slavery, and for the anti-slave Northern states and those in the South who were anti-slavery, that the words spoken by the Vice President, though there were common ground in his exhortations about the union and the preservation and how good we are together, didn't quite mesh with those two sides of the country. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.